Good evening, everybody, and Rosemary. Evening, Rosemary. Welcome to another forum for the People's Republic of Christchurch. Jan, for some odd reason, was worried about health and safety. So somebody opposite her said, "I'm feeling healthy and safe." And I do have to tell you that the limit of the number of people in this room is 49. And so so what we do, age, yes. Yeah. No, John, it's your IQ. And what we do is we go 47, 48, 49, 1, 2. So it's quite easy. We can get around the law. No sweat at all. Thanks for coming along again. And I just want to introduce Jan, who feels that maybe what she's going to say won't be of interest to people, but I think I've never ever heard Jan talk about anything that I wasn't interested in. And I think as the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, she brought a rigour and the most important thing for me, I struggle with science, and it's great when somebody can talk about scientific things in a language I understand, and that is a great skill. And for a physicist, Jan makes quite a lot of sense. I don't understand physics either, but Jan, I thought it was important after we had Tim speak to us a few weeks ago from ECAN perspective in our rivers, that we started looking at the science behind some of the stuff. That we started looking, this long-term stuff on water. Water is a really big issue for New Zealand and the world, and Jan wrote some significant papers on water. And so, without further ado, welcome to Jan.
Okay. Oh gosh, scary crowd. I do want to begin with some caveats. I'm going to talk today about water quality. I am not an expert on water quality. In a way, I think that it's an advantage actually when you try to explain it to other people, not to be an expert sometime. The current work that I'm spending most of my time on is the Interim Climate Change Committee. And we finished our 2 reports a week or so ago, and we're due to launch them. And I said to Gary, I'd be happy to come along and talk climate change and particularly electricity. But as it turned out, we weren't allowed to launch them publicly, so I couldn't do that. So I just said offhandedly, I'll do water quality. And then on Sunday, I really regretted it. So I sat in front of the computer. But I am going to talk very much about water quality, and I've chosen that title deliberately. You'll see the subtitle says a primer. Basically, I'm going to be very simple. There'll be people in this room who will have specialised knowledge about all sorts of aspects, but I'm really just priming people to ask questions, to learn some of the language, learn some of the basics. And I have no special knowledge of Canterbury rivers, so I'm not focusing on them. I'm not talking about water bottling, so if you've come here to hear about that, you might want to leave now and give us all a bit of air. I am going to spend some time on the history of water quality, because I think with environmental problems, I always find it interesting to look back in time, because we can delude ourselves that everything was great in the old days, and history can often put things into context. So, Gary, next slide. So there are 2 water problems at the highest level. One of them is water quality, and one of them is water quantity, who gets access to the water. And of course the quantity one is a huge issue in Canterbury, the quality one as well, across much of the rest of the country, but quantity one particularly hot in Canterbury. The 2 of course are connected, because the bigger the body of water, the more the pollutant, if you like, will be diluted, or the faster the flow of water, the less of a problem the pollutant will be, because its concentration will be less. So there is that connection between the two. When water bodies become the water becomes very small or in quantity or flows very slowly, then the concentration of the pollutants coming into it will be consequently higher. So there is that connection, but I am talking very much about quality today, and I'm talking about it from a national perspective. So I'm not being local here. Sorry, I've only been in Christchurch a year. So next slide, Gary. I think it's actually worth always beginning to note that for Maori, the tangata whenua, the relationship with water is very important. I mean, when they introduce themselves, they say, this is my awa, this is my river, as well as this is my mountain. So there's a very, very strong connection, and particularly strong in Whanganui, where they have the saying, I am the river, it translates as I am the river and the river is me. So an absolute, very strong identity with it. But I think increasingly for all of us, water's become an issue. So here we go, next slide. Healthy water on the left, unhealthy on the right, but it's kind of complicated. And as I said earlier, it's not a new problem. It's changed its nature through history. Environmental problems change over time, and often they leave legacies behind them, and sometimes we just get bored with them and forget about them and just go on to the next one. So anyway, this is might be a bit odd, so I'm starting my history bit here. This is 1906, this is Dunedin, and this is the first reticulated sewage system in the country. So what we had in the South Island here, particularly in the 1860s, a gold rush, a wave of gold miners rolling on from California to Australia to New Zealand. And gold rush means what it said, people rushing into towns and out to the gold fields, and my great-grandfather was one of them. But the result was raw sewage, bacteria and disease. And you may not know that the typhoid was known as colonial fever because it was so bad, particularly in Dunedin. And then mining had another effect besides sewage. This is gold mining, sluicing, directing jets of water onto gravel slopes and putting huge amounts of sediment into water. We actually had a law that gave the Governor-General the right to declare certain rivers as sludge channels for the disposal of mine tailings. And in fact...
Great.
Oh, sorry, am I going in and out or something?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I'll try to stay in. But the miners had greater rights over the use of rivers than farmers did for irrigation. And of course, it wasn't just mining. We had flax mills, and even in Christchurch, of course, tanneries, and those sorts of things were really bad for water. So things always weren't great in the old days. And then we had another change, which was the invention of refrigeration. A ship, 1882, highly significant technological breakthrough for the young country, the time young colonial country, I should say. Thousands of lambs going off from Dunedin to London, refrigerated. And what this did was mean that the young colony no longer could now produce meat and, in fact, butter and cheese for more than its own population. And so that made pasture very, very valuable. And this is what we had. Gary? Right, so you can see there, they're actually sowing seed while the stumps of the forest are still burning. That's how desperate they were to get pasture. And of course, as those forests were felled, the soil washed away fast on steep hillsides into gullies and streams, and the new pasture, of course, did not remain fertile for long. And that, in a way, is one of my big themes for tonight, is this business of loss of soil from the land, becoming sediment in the water, taking the fertility with it, taking it off the land where you want it, into the water where you don't.
Hey Jan, just bring the mic across this way so that you're speaking into it, because you're speaking the other way at the moment.
Is that getting
so
better?
The mic's in front of you. Yeah.
Okay, do I need to start again from the beginning?
No.
I was actually joking. Okay. So this next photo, Gary, is, I don't know if any of you have seen that. This is the bridge to nowhere. Again, near the Whanganui River. I've actually visited this, and this is such a wonderful symbol of what was going on. They actually built this bridge because they expected all these farms to go through, and it was about the same time they were discovering that actually it wasn't always a terribly good idea to fell the forest and create pasture. So it's a bridge to nowhere, which reputedly only had one vehicle ever cross it. And it does have another bridge nearby called the Bridge to Somewhere, which I've never actually seen. But anyway, so this was what it was all about. It was about sheep, and that transition to a pastoral economy has greatly accelerated the natural erosion that goes on in this geologically young country. And high wool prices, of course, incentivised overgrazing, which again exacerbated the erosion. But something has happened over the last few years, because we used to have, 30 years ago, we had 23 sheep each. We now only have 8. And when I lived in the States, I used to say, what's New Zealand like? And I'd say, well, I think at that stage we've got 15 sheep each, and I think they got a picture that we would have 15 sheep in our backyard. A bit of explaining. But of course what's happened is this next slide, this major land use change from sheep. And we've had these calls of dirty dairying. And I think one of the things I want to do tonight is put this in perspective. I mean, it's a new factor, but there's a lot of other things going on. What, of course, accelerated this was, you sort of trace how did these things happen. And a lot of it had to do with the discovery of gas in Taranaki, and particularly the Kapuni gas field, where they were able to, one of the big projects, make urea, make nitrogen fertiliser out of gas, and so it will use gas to make nitrogen fertiliser, I should say. And that, together with irrigation, means that you can pretty well grow grass at will, when and where you want it, both the artificial nitrogen fertiliser and the water. You're no longer dependent on clover as you were in the old days. And so those factors together sort of have caused this great increase in pollution, in dairying, I should say. So I'll come back to that in a minute.
That's not dairying.
It was a slip of the tongue. I did not intend that slip of the tongue. I'm serious. Right,
Gary got the slides in the wrong order.
The big three pollutants from a national point of view are these. Now, industrial.
Mike, just bring the mic across that way so you're speaking. Yeah, that's
so
right.
I need to keep my eye on what he's doing to make sure he's on the right picture.
Yeah.
If I turn around like this, maybe I can do that. Right. Yeah. Okay. This is a little bit Mickey Mouse, I said to Gary before. It's a little bit Mickey Mouse, the setup here. He was a bit offended, but...
It was the Mickey that did it.
So, industrial discharges, the things that come out of pipes, are relatively easy to deal with. And now these agricultural sources of water pollutants are the main challenge. 3 different kinds of pollutants, right? Click, Gary, click. Sediment, which I've been talking a lot about. Soil, basically washed into water, and then we change its name and call it sediment. Layers of mud smothering stony riverbeds, smothering the life in them, creating footholds for pest plants and creating murky water. And there are apparently places in New Zealand where you've got originally had stony riverbeds and there's a metre of mud, sediment on top of it. And don't underestimate that. In the 70s we used to worry a lot about erosion, and then we said we got a bit tired of that and went on to something else. But actually this is still a massive problem in this country. The second one is pathogens, basically the microbes that make you sick, coming from human and animal waste. And then thirdly, nutrients, nutrients, good things, the one I'm going to spend most time on, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus, or those are the ones that have worry. Make plants grow, good thing on land where you want plants to grow, bad thing in water where you don't. So I'm going to talk about each of these in turn. So first of all, sediment, and so if we have a look here, Gary, I couldn't resist putting this in. This is actually Lake Tekapo. And the beautiful turquoise colour of Lake Tekapo, you may not be aware, is caused by what's called glacial flour, the very, very fine sediment that comes in, the natural process of the glacier coming into Tekapo, and it remains so fine, it remains suspended in the water, which is why you get that turquoise colour. So really, the point of the slide is just really to say New Zealand is a geologically young country, steep hills and so on, steep mountains, a country of high natural erosion, and that goes on. But what we're really concerned about now is that being exacerbated. And so we get things like this. Click. Gary. There we go. Oh, that's the wrong picture. Never mind. Did you miss one?
No, you did.
Well, anyway, go back one. That was just keep keep going. Next, just go past the heading. I didn't realise they were like that. But, so that's a classic thing you see right across the country, and you know, again, that feed, it's not near a river, but that's going to feed sediment into a river. Okay, next one, Gary. Yeah, and so that's Hawke's Bay, and again, that's a legacy of erosion over decades. And again, a lot of it's going back to sheep and overgrazing and felling forest that should never have been felled. Right, so what's this one? Okay, it's another erosion photo. Next. Yeah, and you know, also when you do construction, roads and so on by rivers, you're going to get a lot of sediment going in. So, you know, it just seems very ordinary sediment, but it's very, very destructive. So moving on to pathogens, and of course these came to the fore with the outbreak of gastro in Havelock North. And that really was a big surprise because I think they traced it back to sheep. And we hadn't really, it sort of brought home to the fact that that kind of thing can actually affect town water supplies just through travelling through the groundwater. Another photo of pathogens. There's a point source. We distinguish in water quality between point sources, something that comes out of a pipe, and non-point or diffuse sources that are spread all over. And you know, the point ones are generally easier to deal with. It's obvious why. It's the diffuse ones that are the big challenge. All right, next. Here's a sort of diffuse one. Gary, next. Oh, help, something's gone wrong with my slides. Go back.
That's not there.
It must be there, something's gone wrong.
Well, it's not, Jan.
Something to do with the system, I'm sorry. That was a photograph of cows standing in water doing their business. No, the next one.
It's a close-up.
I wanted to make the point that scientists really call it direct deposition, but we call it something else. So moving from, I wonder how many other photographs are coming through. Now I'm worried.
I'll tell you.
All right. So if we move on to number 3, so sediment, pathogens, nutrients. So the first problem you get from nutrients is invasive exotic plants, and that one, second from the right, hornwort. And there are lakes around Rotorua that are just absolutely choked with that. Yeah. Next photo. Yeah, this is periphyton. This is what the rest of us call slime. And you'll see this so commonly around New Zealand now, coating stones, coating logs, brown, green slime, long trails of it in the water. And that again is, there we go, that's due to too much nutrition in the water, too much plant growth where you don't want it. And then another kind of plant growth we get are called algal blooms, algae, tiny things that multiply very, very fast and create mats over the surface. If you go to the next one, Gary, that's sometimes they become toxic. I think we've got another one. Yeah. And when you get a warning like this that there are toxic algae, the one's called cyanobacteria, which is a bit of a mystery to me because cyano is the Greek word for green and blue, and they're usually red and brown. But anyway, it's cyanobacteria, and a dog that takes a couple of licks from one of these can die. So these are very serious, these toxic algae. And then what a result of all of these things, both the sediment and the nutrients, next slide please Gary, is really the whole ecology of the fresh water really gets wrecked, and so you get fewer mayflies and stoneflies, and you get more snails and worms and things like that. And you get effects on fish and water birds, because that's a whio, a blue duck, and of course it spoils our enjoyment of these water bodies. So get these things coming together, and together they have this effect on the freshwater ecology. So I'm going to go a bit scientific now. Next slide, Gary. So those of you who are gardeners will know the 3 nutrients that are essential, 3 elements essential for plant growth are N, P and K, nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. And so if we go to look at those, the next slide. The main source of N and nitrogen is simply urine, and it is particularly the urine of cows, and that's just because they do a whole lot in one spot. And so if you imagine a situation where you've got sheep on dry land, particularly where it's hilly, they pee a little bit, runs out, tends to spread out, and the nitrogen in the urine will fertilise the grass. And it's not a problem. But when you have cows, you can get so much in one spot it can actually kill the grass. So the other problem that comes with that is the weight of those large heavy animals, particularly on wet soil. So about the worst situation for nitrogen is when you have cows being brake fed, with the fence where they move it along. When you think about it, they're basically standing on bare ground eating the next bit. And so there's no plants there for them to fertilise, so the nitrogen is just going to get away and there'll be no plants to take it up.
There's an old bloke who can't control his phone.
Right.
That was the person you brought, Jan.
That's not intermission.
Not my fault. So, Gary, if you move on to the next one, phosphorus, which is the major source of phosphorus. Go back.
There isn't any.
Oh, God, this is very frustrating. I'm sorry. Phosphorus comes from a number of sources. Town sewage, manure, superphosphate. Much of it is historic. The phosphorus also occurs naturally in soil. So even soil that hasn't been fertilised with superphosphate, if it washes into rivers, it takes phosphorus with it, becomes sediment. And what this has done, because the compounds that contain phosphorus are relatively insoluble, is that all that sediment that's come down from the hills and the paths from the sheep farming and so on, there's a lot of phosphorus in with it, and there's kind of been a stockpile of phosphorus lurking in our waterways, and that's the legacy really of sheep farming. But if we look at what I call the recipe for next one, see, this is really messed up. What's Johnny done to it? Your son has messed up my presentation.
Just keep blaming Gary.
Right. So basically, what have you got? You've got nitrogen from urine, you've got phosphorus in the soil, some of it coming in from manure and so on. You need sunlight, because you're talking photosynthesis, because you're talking green plants. There we go. There you go, there's the recipe. And the carbon dioxide, of course, from the air to photosynthesis to get the green plants growing. So I think, if I look at what's happened since really the 1990s in New Zealand, a very high level, I have trouble getting water quality scientists to thoroughly agree with this because they don't like high level, they like detail. It's really this, that we had all these sheep, we cleared all these forests, we put in the sediment, it took phosphorus with it, we had other sources of phosphorus, and then quite suddenly we had this great injection of nitrogen, mainly from the urine of cows, not directly from the urea fertiliser, because what the urea fertiliser, some of it comes from that, a smaller amount, but the urea fertiliser is what enabled that grass to grow and therefore the expansion of the dairying, so it sort of indirectly causes it. And so I think that, I think quite suddenly New Zealand has been taken by surprise with the nutrient problem, because it was sort of like the phosphorus was lurking and then all of a sudden in comes the nitrogen, and it's been a bit of a shock to us because we've had clean water through most of my lifetime anyway. Okay, so chemistry matters, that's the next one. Yes, good. And I think if you want to think about water quality and the nutrient problem in particular, it's really important to understand some basic differences between the nitrogen and the phosphorus. And the nitrogen, most of it is in the form of nitrates, and those are all highly soluble. They will dissolve in water very, very readily, which actually means when they get into water, if it's in a river and it's carried out to sea, it does get rid of it pretty quickly, so if you're not pumping more in. Phosphorus, I call the sticky one, because that's the compounds of phosphorus involved here are relatively insoluble, and so they stick to the sediment in there, but also the means by which these two nutrients get into water is different. So the cow urinates, and the sheep to some extent urinates, and the nitrates trickle through the ground into groundwater, and some of it's taken up by plants, but some of it gets into the groundwater and then into the rivers, or directly into the rivers. Phosphorus gets in by what you might call mechanical means, the crumbling bank that takes the soil and the erosion, the manure that's actually put directly in the water, or indeed the town sewage. So this difference, if you take nothing else away, if you take away a concept of those two are different chemically, and that matters for how you try to deal with them and how you try to stop them. So also, this is not just about what goes into the water, but the nature of the receiving environment, the nature of the water body that the pollutants enter is also pretty important for what the result is. So next slide, Gary. Lakes are more vulnerable. No, if you go back, does the picture take a while to appear? Is that the problem? We did it before.
Again, Gary.
If I ever do this again, I'm coming down for a dry run. Anyway, that is meant to have a photograph of Lake Rotorua on it. Yeah, well, it's actually one of only 2 lakes in the country in which sewage was put directly into lakes, and it's about as silly as you can get. The other one was Horowhenua. It's the most significant example of accelerated eutrophication, this sort of changing of the water in the country in Rotorua. And when we were researching this is another joke, I suppose, there was a paper on eutrophication of Lake Rotorua written in 1969. We've known about this for a long time. And it was written by Dr. G. Fish, which amused me. So. But lakes are more vulnerable than rivers for the obvious reason. They're confined, they don't flush the same way. That's pretty obvious, but less obvious is the next point, which probably doesn't have pictures either. So some rivers are more vulnerable than others. That's meant to be a picture of one of the West Coast rivers. What does it do? It flows fast, gets to the sea quickly. It's going to flush out. Heavy rainfall, it's going to flush out fast. Of course, on the West Coast, you don't have the same sources of the problem as well. But then the next missing photo, is of the Manawatu River, which in one outbreak of concern was labelled the worst river in the world, which was a bit of a...
Hang on, I've just found it.
Oh. Where do you find them?
I don't know.
Okay, go on to the next one, try and find Manawatu. There we go. It's not meant to be a comedy show. But, look at the difference between those 2 rivers, and apart from the kind of land they flow through and the land uses around them. But the Manawatu is wide, it's unshaded, so the sun all gets in, it meanders, it flows slowly, and so it is a very vulnerable river. So it's not just about what goes into these water bodies, it's the nature of the water bodies themselves and how much they can defend themselves, if you like, against the pollution. So what are some of the things we can do about this? Moving on. Better treatment of urban sewage. This is actually the sewage treatment plant at Lake Taupo, because that those cities and towns inland, sewage is a far bigger problem from them than coastal cities in terms of dealing with sewage. There we go. They're actually taking the sewage and treating it and spraying it onto land as fertiliser after taking out the harmful stuff. Riparian planting, riparian meaning banks. Now, start to think about, this is a sort of thing where the difference between phosphorus and nitrogen, the compounds that they exist in this situation, matters. So when you do riparian planting, it's actually pretty good at stopping the phosphorus because it stabilises the banks, so they don't crumble into the water, taking the phosphorus with them. If it's fenced as well, it's much better because then you've got the animals not getting in as well. But if it's nitrate, if it's nitrogen you're worried about, it can be, the riparian planting often doesn't do that much because the urine can trickle down through the soil, get into the groundwater and simply go beneath the root zone into the water body. So that difference between nitrogen being elusive and being able to escape more easily makes it much harder to deal with than phosphorus. Another one we can do is planting eroded hill country. Not enough of that going on around. And just stabilising soil, hills that should never have been cleared in the first place. Wetlands are important, preserving natural ones. One thing about wetlands that is good. Wetlands will actually take care of the nitrogen. So if water is able to trickle through wetlands, that's a good thing. Another one here, next slide. Livestock management. Simple things like bridging rivers, just keeping the animals out, fencing waterways and so on. Obvious things to do. And that at the bottom is a photo of a herd home, getting the animals off the wet, pugged paddocks, particularly in winter, spending some of the time indoors, because cows don't eat all day, they don't have to be out there all day, keeping them off the land. There is, of course, I'll go on a slight sidetrack here, a connection between the nitrate that gets into the waterways and the third most important greenhouse gas that we have to deal with in New Zealand, which is nitrous oxide. So they both really have the same source. The major source is animal urine. Moving on. And spraying, and one thing this is interesting actually, spraying shed effluent. We see effluent ponds outside on dairy farms, and we see the effluent collected and then sprayed onto land, and if it's done well, it's good. It actually acts as fertiliser, but it's pretty easy not to do it well through often no fault of the farmer. If you're putting it onto land that's too wet, you're just moving the problem around. So you're taking the point source, which is your milking shed, and you're turning it into a diffuse source by spreading it around in a way that where the plants can't take it up. And anyway, so moving on again, I thought I just finished with the Canterbury River. That's the upper Rangitata. I once broke my nose on the Rangitata River. So. Okay, I'm done. That was harder
Right.
than I thought.
Right.
Questions? Pete.
Quite happy with this now.
It won't be too painful, Jan. Just in the urban catchment with us, we do have just sort of one major risk in the way we treat sewage, which is Bromley, which is responsible for about 2% of the city's entire carbon emissions.
Bromley.
The Bromley treatment plant.
Right, yeah.
I was just wondering, would you recommend any alternative methods for dense urban places like this at a neighborhood scale or treated wetlands or other kind of systems that might work better?
Sorry, not an authority. Can't do it.
Come on.
I can't. I'm not going to make it up. I'm high level.
Jan, can I just say that the elephant in the room is actually human nitrous oxide emissions. For every gram of protein we consume, we emit about a third of a gram of nitrous oxide. And a good deal of that ends up in the sea, but eventually it ends up in the atmosphere. So the worst source of greenhouse gases is actually the people in the room here.
I don't think that's correct. That's not correct.
I'll show you the numbers.
No. Certainly, if we eat meat and milk, those forms of farming do create almost all the nitrous oxide in New Zealand, but humans not directly.
Transport emissions are very, very significant.
But not for nitrous oxide. That's nitric oxide, nitrogen dioxide.
I can just have one
And
small
at small
comment.
amounts it doesn't. Yeah.
One small comment about nitrous oxide. The reason I don't think that's correct is a colleague did some pioneering work on asthma and really surprisingly found that people with strong asthma give out N2O, the gas you're talking about, unlike most other people without asthma.
That's strange.
That's why it's strange, but I find the
No,
other
it's-
statistic difficult.
It may also be a protective for skin cancer too. People with high nitrate, whichever oxide it is on the skin, tend to have lower incidence of skin
Yeah,
cancer.
don't know about that.
I have wondered about the new subdivisions that go around Christchurch, and they all have this hollow where I don't know whether it's for just stormwater or whether all of these subdivisions have been, there has been a provision or somebody clever. You know how rural properties have a separate septic system? Do these new subdivisions going around Christchurch, possibly, is it only stormwater, or do they have their own, have they engineered their own sort of septic system? That, because Bromley
Only
was
stormwater.
terribly damaged by the earthquakes and the pipes that, you know, there was a renewal of all the pipe work that went out to the sea. And
There's a water engineer over here who can answer.
oh,
Dave. This isn't a Jan question, it's a Dave question.
Sorry, I missed it.
Do new subdivisions have their own system?
Swales.
Yeah, one of the things that we're trying to do on the new subdivisions is create detention ponds. So these form two basic amenities. One is literally recreation, and secondly, in a big rain event, these are used literally as holding water back, so that discharge to pipes, rivers, etc. is more controlled. So that's a very simplistic answer there. Oh yeah, and improves water quality as well.
Just stormwater?
Just
stormwater.
Just stormwater, right.
Hi Jan, would you like to comment on legacy issues in terms of catchments with taking a long time for nutrients, particularly in groundwater, to flow through, and also comment on nitrogen and other nutrients in drinking water?
Yeah, okay. So one of the problems with nitrate is when it gets into drinking water, you can get this, we can get the blue baby syndrome you don't want, and that's a somewhat of a problem in Canterbury. I believe there are wells around Ashburton where the nitrate level in the water is too high for them to, for animals to even drink it. So that nitrate concentrations in water is a health issue as well. There is a sort of odd legacy issue to do with nitrate, which is sometimes referred to as the load to come. So that is nitrate that entered the groundwater many years ago and is slowly coming through the groundwater into aquifers. And so I am told that with Lake Taupo, for example, there is 70 years sort of nitrate that has been put into that catchment that is still on its way to the lake. So that's a worry, yeah. You don't get instant, you can't close things.
And that would be an example of the post-Second World War where they opened up that land for service people to go farming.
Subsidies on fertiliser.
Yeah, and they fertilised it to make it. Yeah.
Gary. Brief question.
Good day, Jan. A few years ago, you published a report about flooding and the coastal environment, which showed that Christchurch is severely exposed to erosion, etc. Recently, there was a Environment Aotearoa report published 2 weeks ago or so. There is no record of this erosion or the flood risk in Christchurch. Do you know why this is? It's gone missing from the Tonkin and Taylor reports for an unknown reason. Do you know why this is and how it can be addressed? Because this is very serious.
No, I have no idea. The report I did was one of 2 reports on sea level rise, and really explaining why the sea was rising, what was driving it, and what the effects would be in different places. But in terms of Christchurch's vulnerability, and in fact we did the mapping across the country, and we just simply mapped the areas that were within, I'm trying to remember, 0.5 metre and 1 metre and 1.5 metres of the spring high tide. Doesn't necessarily mean that something low to the sea is necessarily that vulnerable with sea level rise, because lots of other factors come in, but it is the first thing you would look at is obviously height above the sea. So it didn't go further than that, but the work that we did has been picked up and developed a whole lot more, but I'm not up with the play. I'm no longer the Commissioner.
Dave.
Here's a high-level question for you. Given what you've just said about sheep and moving into dairy, big picture, where do you think New Zealand is going to head? Are we going to curtail the amount of cows that we plant? Are we going to try and go back to a green, a country, or literally will the big dollar sign and the chasing the Fonterra dream win out in the end?
Well, yes, I think about a lot of this in terms of the agricultural greenhouse gases, because I'm changing subjects a bit here, but I'm a member of the Interim Climate Committee, which is the precursor to the Climate Commission that will be created when the Zero Carbon Bill becomes legislation, hopefully later this year. All right, so, and one of the questions the government has given us to do with is to do with the agricultural greenhouse gases. And as I'm sure you know, Dave, is it? Yeah, there's methane and there is nitrous oxide. So methane, the two together are about half of our greenhouse gas in total. And the methane comes from all ruminants. It's not just cows, it's sheep, it's deer, it's goats, not horses so much, because they tend to be rear gut fermenters, as they say. Not chickens or pigs much, just a bit, but the ruminants. And in terms of the numbers at a national level, what comes out of the sheep is, I think, roughly equivalent to what comes out of the cattle. The nitrous oxide, which is about 10%, it's about in its effects about 1/5 of as much as the methane, comes from mainly the urine of cows. So if New Zealand is a country where we've had this good rainfall, we've been really, really good at growing grass. And when you have parts, land that's good at growing grass, doesn't necessarily mean you can grow other crops there that well. Some places yes, some places no. So this is really quite a dilemma for New Zealand. So what kind of future do we have? Do we have a future where we have fewer animals, but we have this, it's very high quality, it's all traceable and all those sorts of things, and we sell $100 lamb chops to rich people in the world instead of $100 lambs, or is that where the meat is heading? Will the milk go on? Will the demand for the milk go on as much as it is now? There is more milk from New Zealand that crosses national boundaries than from any other country in the world. 30% of the milk that's travels from one country to another around the world comes from this country. Is that going to go on? Don't know. So one of the things we exercise our minds on the Interim Climate Committee is what other uses can we put this land to? And that's not an easy question to answer, because we have been really, really good at these ruminant animals. So, I don't know that my crystal ball is any much better than anyone else's, but of course what we do have, we do know globally that we cannot feed the world on animal protein. It's just not possible. And there is a lot of research going on into different forms of non-animal protein, Impossible Burger and so on and so forth, eggs and milk as well. And it is conceivable that before very long we may be growing meat sort of in factories, as it were, in vats, without the animal, that is virtually identical to the meat of the animal. And so some 2 or 3 years ago, I actually had to speak at the Red Meat Conference in New Zealand. There is such a thing. So, you know, and that issue, the synthetic protein, if you like, was the theme of the whole conference. So the agriculture sector itself is worried about this and well aware of it. So there are reasons other than greenhouse gases and water pollution to think about what is the future of meat and milk, and what is the future of our agricultural land, and what should we be doing with it.
Will we hit a tipping point now? Will the tipping point kick that in? Or make it more? Or will we just carry on?
Well, I think we're seeing that. I think the dairy conversions stopped some time ago, and even the ones that are being pushed now in the Mackenzie, that's all coming to an end. So I think that there's a general consensus that you can't push all this too much further. We'll go back the other way. One thing that always worried me about the conversion of sheep farms to dairy farms was simply the investment that was involved. You know, the millions of dollars with all the, and so once you've done that, it's very hard to walk away from it. You know, you get a lot of stranded investment, and that worried me while that was going on. That you know, so if the prices changed and things, then a lot of them would be stuck. And we can see the volatility of the prices for the milk anyway. You know, it's a risk. You know, the ones that I mean, was lucky enough to visit Synlait recently, actually down at Rolleston, and that's actually a really interesting company. They sell tins of infant formula that are this big for $80 in China, and you know they are very profitable, and they are also trying to have the highest environmental standards on the farms that supply their milk. In fact, they insist on it. So they're quite. So there is also a reaction among the more innovative companies in the agricultural sector, where they recognise that doing things well environmentally can give them a heads up ahead of the market. So there is quite a lot of change going on.
Jan, I spent some time working on Mid-Dome down near Lumsden, where erosion was proving to be a problem, not only for the hillsides, but also for the adjoining rivers and affecting the fishing. And it led me later to write a paper when I discovered that most of the siltation that was occurring in the Brooklands Lagoon was actually coming from overstocking in the hill country at the back. It led me to sort of wonder about what we do with our rivers, and I'm wondering if that's a sort of one of the three you point out drives me to suggest that might be a fourth one. As we dam our rivers, we prevent the washout into the ocean, which is protecting some of our shoreline. Of course, the beach used to be at Fitzgerald Avenue here in Christchurch, and it's built its way out. Whereas the the Waitaki River is now being eroded along the coast because we've prevented that feeding, protecting, as it were, the coastal horizon, as it were. And I'm wondering if perhaps we need to think not just about the nutrient loadings, but the physical attributes that we apply to our rivers and the damage that creates, and costing into that burden that obviously the coastal communities are paying down there.
Yeah. Well, my focus was on the pollutants that are actually in the water rather than the other things that are going on. This is a classic environmental dilemma, though. We often think that, you know, it's economy versus the environment, and that's what it is, but it's often environment versus environment. And so the hydroelectricity that we have, those dams, are actually extraordinarily important in our electricity system. And when you think of if we're going to reduce the greenhouse gases, if we're going to reduce particularly the carbon dioxide from energy consumption, we have to replace our fossil fuels with something, and that's got to be electricity. Yep. So I see more electricity in our future. And the hydroelectric dams are actually, especially the lakes, are actually enormously important for storing that energy for times when it's needed. So yes, you have hydroelectric dams doing damage to the environment, but you also have them extremely important in the fight against climate change.
Does that suggest that the social dividend that accrues from the hydroelectric dams should not be privatised, so that it's private profit and public debt?
I'm never keen on private profit and public debt, that's what I say. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, yeah.
Thanks, Jane. Just a question coming back to your work on the committee currently. You mentioned earlier there just around the innovation that you see within the agricultural sector, and you mentioned Synlait there. Is the committee, do they have permission to comment about the structure of Fonterra? And
No.
but
Well, yeah.
Done.
Yeah. I mean, there was something wrong with the way Fonterra was created at the beginning.
Are you able to highlight the effectiveness of Synlait as a company and compare that to another large dairy cooperative?
Well,
in a negative sense.
Reports written, but no, yeah. Really, the Dairy Sector Restructuring Act, which I believe has been changed, that created Fonterra, actually, I think was really very damaging, because what it did was require Fonterra to pick up anybody who wanted to supply milk, and at least they were quite a long way away from them, from any of the factories. Which is why the West Coast doesn't have Fonterra on it, because it's too far to go to Fonterra dairy factories. But I mean, where else can you produce a product and have a guaranteed buyer at the same price as everybody else? I mean, it's an odd thing to do, and I think that did some of the damage, because Fonterra was there as the cushion for expanding the dairying. Yeah.
In Copenhagen, I forget what year it was, but that was the climate change meeting, the international one. John Key set up an international research group on how to, innovation on agricultural emissions and what to do about it. How successful has that group been?
I don't know so much about the international group, but there is quite a lot of research going on in New Zealand, particularly around Massey, around Palmerston North, on trying to do like they've managed to. If you take sheep or cows, you actually get quite a range between animals as to how much methane they produce, just genetic variation. And so they've actually managed to breed low methane sheep, and they're now trying to breed low methane cows. They're doing experiments on quite a lot of things. I wrote a whole report on a lot of this, so you could get hold of that, but I think I better stop as I'll go on too long. But yeah, there is some progress, but it's actually bloody hard. And I think the reason is you've got these ruminant animals that have evolved over millions of years to be the way they are, and the way they are has been very useful to us as humans. And when you try to change, the kind of microbes they have in their rumens, which is the first of the four stomachs, then nature fights back, because it's evolved to be that way because it worked for the animal. And so you're trying to change the biology of the animals, which is very hard. So I think we may make some progress there, but I don't think it's going to be a lot. And I think this whole rise of synthetic protein is going to change things from another angle anyway. But we seem to be talking climate, not... Can I eat a hamburger now?
Hi there. So we've talked a lot about the problem, and we know some of the solutions, but how do we incentivize farmers to actually implement these solutions in a feasible way where we'll actually see change within the rivers?
Right, well, there is a lot going on already. I mean, there is a lot of riparian planting, a lot of fencing of waterways, bridging of waterways for stock to walk over, effluent ponds with spraying it onto land and so on. So there has been a lot of change, but the problem is the scale of the problem is so large you don't always see it. But yeah, if you had a bunch of farmers in here, they would tell you what things to do.
Hang on. The technical people tell me the battery's died. You've killed the battery.
Okay.
There you go.
So what I'm just saying is there has been a lot of change, but we still have a problem. That's why I'm going to summarise it like that. I mean, it's hard to... it's actually hard to look across, various waterways and decide whether they're getting better or worse or much the same, because there's so much variability, so many parameters that you can measure, so many variables, and you know, if you measure, say, nitrate in a river, that's going to vary with the season. It's going to vary with other things, and you know, if there's rain and the flow is faster, it's going to vary too. So, just taking samples and measuring can, you know, get you some information, but it is very hard to measure whether things are getting better or worse.
So how good is our water testing regime as it stands? We had a talk on this a couple, 3
Yeah.
months ago.
Yeah.
I was very far from convinced, particularly invertebrates declining and some nutrients improving, and I couldn't figure out what the fuck was going on.
Well, there
was
is
going on.
There is what's called a national policy statement under the RMA that the government has, which the last government initiated, and they seem to be very slow to add things to it. So I did several submissions on things that should be added, including one on they needed to start measuring MCI, macro invertebrate index, something or other index, community index. And I think they're starting to do that now. So these things change pretty slowly.
Yeah. It's very political.
It's very political. Yeah. Yep. And you know, the country people point their fingers at the city and say your rivers are much worse.
Which in some cases is very true. Pauaho Heathcote ain't in good shape, for example.
Last question. Yes, thanks, Jen. One of the things I'm feeling about water and climate change is that we point at those people over there that they have to do something, those farmers, those nasty farmers, you know. And as somebody just said, the city's as bad as anything else in terms of the state of the rivers. And I wonder how many people here have washed their cars and let the water go into the stormwater. You know, this is just one, but how many, hands up, how many people wash their... But what I'm just saying is that, you know, we do lots of things. We do lots of things. How many of us drove here tonight? How many of us rode a bike and caught a... Like, we've got to change the way we've lived. It's not enough just to point fingers at other people. We have to change the way we live.
Good luck.
I was there.
My family is
No, I just said use washing powder with no phosphates in it.
Right. The complexity of this. Hang on. John Patterson always has to have the last say.
We'll carry on. I was just thinking, John, it's the number of people, isn't it? I mean, when I was born, there was 2 billion people on Earth. There's 7 point something billion now, and that's just in our lifetime.
It's John's fault.
That's John's time. So that must be having a hell of a lot of difference on this from when I was born to now. I'm not taking the blame for it all.
The fundamental environmental problem is too many people on the planet. It always comes back to that. So the fundamental environmental problem is too many people on the planet. We've overrun our petri dish.
That's a good point. Oh, you can ask him direct, Marilyn. Here we get a little bit of sectarian violence. Bloody Methodists blaming the Catholics. At least when we had lots of kids, we put them in bunks. We didn't build a whole lot of houses like the Methodists. Anyway, the complexity. The thing I really like about dealing with water is there was no simple solution. The thing I really like to listening to a good scientist is they actually explain things that we've actually encourage us to look harder and longer, and as Rosemary said, and what we do. And I think that's the thing, like when your committee reports, Jan, I think the really important thing for all of us is how to empower us in taking personal action for the planet. And that's what a younger generation are actually really challenging us about. And like there's a young group going to be starting here, they're going to call themselves the Monday Club, I think, and they are really tuned into the planet, and we need to actually listen to what they're saying, and we need to listen to the good scientists, and the good scientists need to be talking to the younger ones as well. And so thanks for your address, and I'm sorry I was so hopeless with the slides.
Yes, terrible.
Some of those pictures just disappeared in front of me. But it's great that we've got Jan in the city. And I know that you get frustrated about being dragged up to Wellington all the time to talking national issues. But in fact, we need these sort of brains telling us what the hell do we do in Christchurch. So the sooner you drop out of your Wellington scene, the better. But I'd just like, on behalf of us all, to say thanks very much.